She fell hard. Both hands hit the ground before her knees did. A cardboard box split open on the wet sidewalk. Clothes spilled out. Pair of shoes. A phone charger with no phone. She stayed down for a moment. One hand pressed flat to the pavement, the other pressed to her stomach. The door behind her was already closed. The lock had already turned. She was 22, 7 months pregnant, and the people who had locked that door were her parents. No bags except what had scattered across the concrete. No plan. No call she could make. No one coming. Her name was Mara. She sat there in the dark with one hand still resting on her belly, and she made a decision that night nobody around her believed would amount to anything. What she found inside that building proved them all wrong. Stay with me on this one. Mara had $47 in her checking account. That is not a typo. $47. She had been working the early shift at a diner 3 towns over, but when she started showing, her manager started cutting her hours. By month 7 she had no hours left. He hadn't technically fired her. He had simply stopped putting her name on the schedule, and eventually she stopped checking it. Her parents were the kind of people who kept the peace at all costs until the cost became personal. When her father found out his unmarried daughter was 7 months pregnant and the man responsible had left the state 2 months prior, he didn't yell. He didn't argue. He walked to the front door, opened it, and stood there waiting until she understood. No conversation. No second chance. Just a door and a man standing beside it until she walked through. She took what she could carry in one trip. One cardboard box. It split open on the pavement when she set it down wrong. She spent the first night in her car. The heater worked if you held the vent knob at a specific angle. She got maybe 3 hours of sleep. In the morning she drove to the county library because the library had free Wi-Fi. She bought a coffee she didn't need just to feel like she wasn't loitering. She wasn't looking for real estate. She was looking for anything. A room. A couch. Someone who rented cheap and didn't ask too many questions. She found the listing by accident. She had clicked through to a county government page looking for emergency housing resources, followed a broken link to a tax auction page, and scrolled past it twice before the number made her stop. Minimum bid, $12. The listing was for the former Holt County Detention Facility. Built 1887. Brick and iron construction. No running water. No electrical service. Decommissioned in the early 1950s. Current condition. Severe structural concerns. The county noted sale as is. No warranties expressed or implied. The county had attached photographs. None of them were flattering. She looked at those photographs for a long time. The building was ugly. There was no other word. Squat and heavy. All faded brick and rust-streaked iron bars across every window. It sat at the end of a gravel road 4 miles outside town with nothing around it. The roof had partly caved on the west end. The front door hung open at a wrong angle. The county just wanted the liability off its books, but it had 4 walls, and most of the roof was intact, and it was sitting on a piece of land that would belong to whoever paid $12 for it. She placed the bid. She won the auction that same afternoon. No other bidders. The county emailed a certificate of title within the hour. She printed it at the library for 15 cents. She had $34.85 left. She drove out to see it that evening. The gravel road cut straight through flat scrubland and ended at the building. She sat in the car for a while looking at it through the windshield. In the fading light it looked like exactly what it was. An abandoned place. A building the world had used up and set aside. She got out of the car. The front door groaned when she pushed it. The intake room still had the original desk bolted to the floor. Metal benches along the walls. A dust-covered window nobody had cleaned in a long time. Dead and heavy air. She walked through into the main cell block. 8 cells along a central corridor, 4 on each side. The iron doors had rusted open decades ago. Some of the bunks were still mounted to the walls. She walked the full length of the corridor and came back. Went up to the second floor, walked it, came back down. She stood in the middle of the ground floor corridor with both hands on her belly. She said out loud to no one, "Okay, we can work with this." Nobody heard her say it, but she meant it. For Mara, the calculation had always been simple. What do I have and what can I do with it? She had a building with walls and most of a roof. She had $34. She had 8 weeks until the baby came. Those were the numbers she had to work with. She moved in that night. The first week was survival math. No power. No water. She dealt with the water first. There was a hand pump well out behind the building. The iron handle was nearly seized from years of disuse. She worked it for 20 minutes before anything came up. The first water that came out ran brown. She pumped until it ran clear, then filled every container she had. 2 water bottles, a large pot from the car trunk, a thermos, a camp stove from the trunk with 1 gas canister that she rationed carefully. Power came from the car battery through an extension cord to a single work light. It gave her enough to move by after dark. She started cleaning, not because she felt inspired, because the alternative was sitting still with her thoughts, and her thoughts at that point were not useful. She needed her hands busy. She hauled debris out to the car 4 times in 3 days and drove it to the county dump. She found out later she wasn't supposed to use the dump without a permit. Nobody stopped her. By the end of the first week, the ground floor was clear. The broken glass was gone. The dead bird near the intake window was gone. The animal nest from the corner was gone. The cells smelled like bleach now instead of rot. Not comfortable, but something she had made herself. Making it had kept her sane. She set up her sleeping place in the cell at the far end of the ground floor corridor. The bunk frame was still bolted to the wall, so she didn't have to sleep on the floor. A foam pad from the car trunk served as the mattress. 2 blankets, a battery lantern, a small stack of books from the library. It was on the 4th day of cleaning that she noticed the wall. She had been working the back section of the main corridor, scrubbing grime off the brickwork, when something stopped her. The rear wall of the corridor didn't match the rest. The brickwork ran in a slightly different direction, a different pattern. Newer mortar, though still old. Whoever had patched it had plastered over the seam and painted it the same gray as everything around it. Almost invisible. Almost. She tapped on it. The surrounding wall gave a solid thunk. The patched section gave back a hollow sound. Low and resonant. Empty space behind it. She stood there for a moment. Then she went to the car and got the short pry bar she kept for emergencies. Took 2 hours. She knew she should not have been doing that kind of physical work at 7 months pregnant. She did it anyway, carefully, taking breaks, working methodically. The mortar came free brick by brick. She stacked each one to the side neatly because that was who she was. Behind the brickwork was a wooden door set in an iron frame. The padlock on it had rusted completely through. The shackle snapped off with 1 firm strike. The door opened inward. The room behind it was small, 8 feet by 10 maybe. The air that came out was stale in a particular way, the kind of still air that has been sealed in a space for decades without moving. She held up the work light and looked inside. No cell bunk. No bars. This had never been a cell. Shelves along one wall held old glass jars sealed with wax. Their labels faded completely away. A wooden crate sat in the corner, dry as old bone. And against the far wall, pushed into the corner, was a strongbox. Iron. Riveted. Heavy even before she touched it. She dragged it out into the corridor. No key. She got the pry bar. Struck the lock 6 times. The lid buckled and gave. Inside. A leather-bound ledger. Its cover cracked but intact. Tied shut with a leather lace. A cloth pouch that shifted with a heavy, clinking weight when she moved it. Several folded documents, fragile at their creases. And beneath everything, wrapped in a layer of oilcloth that had kept the contents bone dry, a stack of papers bound with a decaying string. She sat down on the corridor floor, cross-legged. Her belly rested in her lap. She opened the pouch first. Coins. Gold-colored. Heavier than they looked. Each one stamped with a profile and the words United States of America. She lined them on the floor. Counted 22. She set those aside and opened the ledger. The handwriting on the inside cover was careful, precise, in ink that had browned over the years. Sheriff Cyrus Malone. Holt County. Below it, a year, 1924. She turned through the pages slowly. Columns of names, dates, dollar amounts. Margin notes she couldn't interpret alone. But patterns she could see clearly. Money flowing in, regular payments, the same names recurring year after year. She unwrapped the oilcloth bundle last. For large documents, printed in the formal typography of 19th-century legal instruments. She could make out the key details without understanding all the language. Acreage figures, 240 acres. The name appearing on every deed, Amos Cray. Dates from 1886 to 1891. Official stamps. Witness signatures. She photographed everything with her phone, twice through, making sure each frame was clear. Then she wrapped the oilcloth back around the documents, put the ledger and the coin pouch back in the strongbox, and carried it to her sleeping cell and pushed it under the bunk. She made dinner, canned soup on the camp stove. She ate it slowly, sitting on the foam pad, back against the wall of the cell. The baby was pressing against her ribs the way it did when she'd been sitting on the floor too long. She shifted, found a better angle. She ate. She told herself it was probably nothing of consequence. Old records from when the jail was operating. A coin collection someone had stored for safekeeping and never retrieved. Historical clutter from a building that had been in use for nearly 70 years. She would look at it more carefully in the morning. Take the photographs to the library. Maybe find a historian. She turned off the lantern and went to sleep. She had no idea the ledger under her bunk was a record of corruption that reached from 1924 to 1940 and involved families who still held positions in the county. She had no idea the land described in those deeds was not empty scrubland. She had no idea she had just found the reason that a very powerful man had been trying, for 2 years, to make a specific piece of ground disappear into a building permit before anyone looked too closely at who actually owned it. She had no idea. She just went to sleep. She heard the engine at dawn. Not the afternoon she might have expected trouble. The morning. She was at the hand pump out back when she heard tires on the gravel and the idle of a heavy engine. She came around the side of the building. A black pickup truck sat out front. 2 men climbing out of it. 40s. Dressed in work clothes that were too clean to have been worked in. One of them held a clipboard. "This the Holt detention property?" Clipboard asked. "It is," Mara said. He looked at her stomach, looked back at her face. "You the owner?" "I am." He wrote something down. "You're going to be hearing from Dale Greer's office sometime this week. Just a heads up. There are questions about the validity of the tax sale." He said it pleasantly, the tone of a man delivering routine information. Then they both got back in the truck and drove away. She stood in the dust watching them go. She went inside. She did not sit down and worry. She pulled the strongbox from under the bunk, opened it, and spread everything on the corridor floor in the morning light. She started with the ledger. Sheriff Cyrus Malone had been a careful man. The payments ran from 1924 to 1940. Names she didn't recognize going out. Names she didn't recognize coming in. But 3 names appeared with such consistency and regularity that she photographed every page where they appeared, and then went back and photographed them again. She looked at the land deeds. For documents. 240 acres described in the formal survey language of the 1880s. The name on every deed, Amos Cray. And for each deed, the property description laid out in careful detail. Bounded north, east, south. She spread all 4 on the floor and looked at the shape of the land they outlined. She photographed those again too. Then she drove into town. The county recorder's office was in the basement of the old courthouse. The woman at the desk, Beverly, didn't look up when Mara came in. Mara set the photocopied deeds on the counter and asked about the name Amos Cray. Beverly glanced at the papers. Something shifted in her expression. She asked Mara to wait. She came back 20 minutes later with a file folder and set it on the counter carefully. Amos Cray had owned the Holt detention property before the county purchased it in 1902. The adjacent land, the 240 acres described in Mara's deeds, had never been formally transferred to the county. The county had absorbed it by assumption over the decades, ratified by county commissioners in 1931, 1958, and 1979. But the original title had never been legally extinguished. No one had ever gone to court about it. Beverly said, very quietly, "Where did you get these?" Mara said, "Found them." Beverly looked at her for a long moment. "You're going to need a lawyer." Mara drove 2 blocks to the only attorney with a walk-in shingle. A man named Gerald Park, operating out of a converted barbershop, whose door sign said Park Law, appointments preferred. She didn't have an appointment. She told him at the door she didn't have money either, and she'd pay him when she could. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Sit down." She spread the photocopies on his desk. He studied them for 20 minutes without speaking. He asked her to come back the next morning. She was there at 8. Park was already at the door. "The deeds are legitimate," he said. He said it the way someone says something when the certainty of it surprises even them. The original Cray title was never properly extinguished. Adverse possession claims were made administratively, not through the courts. That distinction matters legally. That land may be yours. Then he told her what the land was. 240 acres running north and east of the jail property. And right in the center of it, already permitted, already partially cleared, already capitalized to the tune of $30 million. The site of a mixed-use commercial development being built by a company owned by a man named Dale Greer. Now here's the thing. I know how that sounds. But this is what happened. If you're still with me right now, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Because we are just getting to the part that changes everything. Park contacted Greer's attorney that afternoon. The response came back within 2 hours. The deeds were contested. Greer's office would pursue all available legal remedies. Polished language, professional language, the kind of language that means, we have more resources than you, and we intend to use every one of them. But Mara had not forgotten the ledger. Park spent an evening with the Malone ledger and came back the next morning with a careful expression. 3 names recurring through the payment records. One of those names, he told her, was the grandfather of the current county commissioner. The payments spanned 12 years and corresponded, in several instances, to the exact dates on which county commissioners had formally ratified the county's assumption of the Cray land. "This is no longer just a property dispute," Park said. "What is it?" Mara asked. He chose his words deliberately. "It's evidence that the county's claim to that land was built on a foundation that someone paid to have constructed." She sat with that. Outside the barbershop window, the town went about its morning. Normal, quiet, completely unaware. The nature of the fight had changed. This was no longer Mara against a developer. This was Mara sitting on evidence that implicated county government going back nearly a century. And Dale Greer and the commissioner's office and everyone connected to that land now knew it. Dale Greer came in person 5 days later. He drove a silver SUV up the gravel road, stepped out, and stood with his hands on his hips looking at the building like a man assessing a problem that had recently become inconvenient. He was 60, maybe 65. Broad face. The easy posture of someone who had not needed to prove much with his body for a long time. He wore a company logo on his shirt. Mara came out and stood on the front step. She had called Gerald Park before she walked outside. Park was sitting in his car at the end of the road. Greer said, "I'm not here to make trouble." Mara said nothing. "You paid $12 for this building. I'm offering you $50,000 to walk away from it. No lawyers, no courts, no back and forth. You take $50,000 and that is a serious return on $12. Mara said, "What about the adjacent land?" "The adjacent land is not part of this property. My lawyer says it is." "Your lawyer," Greer said, "works out of a barbershop." "He was right about the deeds," Mara said. Greer looked at her steadily. "Where is that ledger?" "Safe," she said. "He offered $100,000. She said no. He offered to bring her in as a development partner, 20% stake, ongoing income for years. She said no. He told her his attorneys were experienced in exactly this kind of dispute, that litigation of this nature could take years and cost more than any judgment she might recover. She said that might be true. He drove away without another word. For 2 weeks the motions and notices arrived. Gerald Park walked her through each one. Competing claim filings. requests for the original deeds to be submitted for independent authentication. A letter from the county attorney suggesting that the Cray title had been superseded by decades of administrative recognition. Each document was designed to exhaust her, to make the process feel so large and complicated that $50,000 or $100,000 or whatever came next would eventually seem like the practical choice. She did not take any offer. She also had the baby, which happened right in the middle of all of it. 39 hours of labor at the county hospital. Gerald Park drove her in at 2 in the morning because she had no one else to call. He sat in the waiting room until morning. She named the baby Amos. She came back to the jail 3 days later with a newborn and a legal fight still running and not enough sleep and a foam pad on a jail bunk, and she went back to work. The historian made the difference. Park had contacted the State University History Department about the Malone ledger. A historian there, Dr. Irene Soto, drove down to examine the original. She spent a full day with it. When she was done, she was not casual about what she'd found. The ledger was authentic. More than that, it was significant. Malone's records documented systematic official corruption across 2 decades in Holt County. Multiple names in the ledger had living descendants still active in county government. One name, appearing repeatedly as a recipient of payments marked in the ledger only as consideration, belonged to the father of the sitting county commissioner. Dr. Soto contacted a colleague at the state attorney general's office. The attorney general's office opened an inquiry, not into Mara's property directly, into Sheriff Malone's records and their implications for historical land transfers throughout Holt County. Measured, careful, precisely targeted. And it had an immediate effect on everyone who had been filing motions against a 22-year-old woman with a newborn and a camp stove. Greer's legal team filed no new motions the following week. The week after that, his attorney called Gerald Park directly. Not to threaten, to negotiate. The coins had not been neglected in all of this. Mara had driven the 22 Liberty Gold pieces to a numismatic dealer in the state capital 4 weeks earlier. When she first understood that things might take a while to resolve, the dealer examined each one carefully and paid her $11,000. That money covered the hospital bills. It covered Gerald Park's initial retainer. It covered the crib, the diapers, the small clothes, the pack of tiny socks she had stood holding in the store aisle long enough that a clerk came over to check on her. Now she sat in Gerald Park's barbershop office with baby Amos in a car seat on the floor and read the settlement framework Greer's team had proposed from the first word to the last. She read every line. She asked Park 3 questions. He answered them all. The development could proceed, but on a reduced footprint. On a formally leased portion of the Cray land. Not sold, leased, title remaining with Mara. 30 years. The initial payment would cover the costs of full title authentication and transfer plus a substantial sum on top. Park had spent 4 days arguing every number. He had not been gentle about it. Mara picked up the pen. The initial payment was $320,000. Annual lease income, $48,000 a year, indexed to inflation, for 30 years. She set the pen down. Amos was sleeping in the car seat with one small fist pressed against his cheek. She looked at the document. She looked at Park. "Is this real?" she said. "It's real," he said. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "I need to buy a better camp stove." Park laughed. "The sudden kind. The kind a person lets out before they've decided whether it fits." She drove to the hardware store. She bought a camp stove. She bought a proper sleeping bag. She bought a small water heater that could run off a generator. And she stood in an aisle for too long holding a package of tiny socks. And when the clerk came over and asked if she needed help, she said no. She was fine. She just needed a minute. She was fine. She just needed a minute. The jail took 6 months to make livable. Not beautiful. Livable. Mara was precise about that distinction. She was not trying to create something impressive. She was trying to create something solid and her own. The roof came first. A local contractor named Bud had heard the story through the network of people in small towns who hear everything eventually, and he came out and did the West End repair at cost and wouldn't explain why. New timbers. New slate. 3 weeks. When it was done, the building was weathertight for the first time in 60 years. Running water was next. The county water line ran along the gravel road. Getting a tap connection was a straightforward permit process now that her title was clean and recorded. Beverly at the recorder's office processed the permit herself, and she did it quickly. Electrical service followed. A local electrician ran a line to the building and spent 2 days rewiring the interior. The old cells on the ground floor became rooms. The iron doors were taken down and stored in the rear yard. The bars stayed on the exterior windows because they were structural and because Mara decided they were part of what the building honestly was. You did not pretend a building had been something other than what it was. She turned the intake room into a kitchen and living area. 2 ground floor cells became bedrooms. A third became a bathroom. She did most of the non-electrical, non-plumbing work herself during the hours Amos slept. She learned as she went, made mistakes and corrected them, got better. Gerald Park stopped by one afternoon in the 4th month and stood in the main corridor looking at what she'd made of it. "This is remarkable," he said. She was on a ladder with a paint roller. "Thanks," she said without turning around. He had brought paperwork. The county commissioner, who had been implicated through the Malone inquiry, had resigned his office. The Attorney General's investigation had broadened beyond what the county could quietly contain. Park wanted Mara to know she might be needed as a witness in certain related proceedings. She said she understood. She kept painting. "You don't seem surprised," he said. "I'm not much surprised by things. Anymore," she said. He left and she kept at the wall. Her parents called in the 5th month. Her mother first. A long voicemail, the kind where you can tell someone has written it out and rehearsed it. She said she'd heard what happened. She said she was proud of Mara, and paused in a way that said she knew the word wasn't quite right given everything that had happened, and then said she would like to see Amos, if that was at all possible. Her father called 2 days later. Shorter. More uncomfortable. He said he wanted to come by. He said he understood if the answer was no. Mara sat with both messages for several days. She did not rush. She called her mother back first. She said, "You can come by. Bring food if you want. But understand something. What happened on that sidewalk happened, and it doesn't unhappen because things worked out." Her mother was quiet for a long moment, and then said, I know that." Mara said, "Okay. Come Saturday." Her father was harder. He came alone the following week. He stood in the front room, the kitchen now, with real running water and a proper stove, and looked at the repaired ceiling and the good light coming through the barred windows, and he looked at Amos in the bouncer on the floor. He didn't say very much. Neither did she. When he was leaving, he stood in the doorway and said, "I was wrong." She said, "Yes." He said, "I don't know how to fix it." She said, "You can't fix it. You can just not do it again." He nodded. He left. They were not repaired. They were begun, which is different and more honest. The development broke ground that spring. From the east-facing windows, Mara could see the equipment moving on the site, shapes and diesel sound at a distance, machines and workers building something on land she owned. She watched it sometimes in the evenings when Amos was down. Not with any particular feeling, just watching. The lease checks came quarterly, as the settlement specified. The first one was a number that still did not feel entirely real. She deposited it and went back to work on the second-floor cells, which she had plans for that had nothing to do with bedrooms. A man from a historical preservation trust in the city had reached out after hearing about the Malone ledger and the sealed room and the building's documented history. He wanted to discuss what a formal historical designation might mean for the property and for the larger record of Holt County history. Mara had listened carefully and said she would think about it. She was still thinking. Amos, at 7 months, had developed a loud opinion about most things. Hungry, loud. Bored, loud. But on their walks through the cell block, through the rooms she was turning one section at a time into something livable, he went quiet. He looked at the walls. He looked at the light coming through the iron bars. He seemed entirely untroubled by any of it. She told him on one of those walks what she thought the place could become. He looked at the wall and made a sound she chose to interpret as agreement. That is the thing about a building the world threw away. Dale Greer had looked at the land around it and seen money. The county had looked at the building itself and seen a liability. Everyone who drove past on the gravel road had looked at it and seen nothing worth stopping for. Mara had looked at it and seen what could be made. She had $12. She had a title. She had walls. She started there and she built.